My daughter-in-law packed her designer bags and left for a week. The moment the tires of her luxury SUV hit the street, my son, who had been dead to the world in a wheelchair for 7 agonizing years, suddenly stood up. He walked into the kitchen, his legs shaking, and told me we needed to leave immediately. I dropped my coffee mug, and what I discovered next changed everything. Before I continue this story, take a deep breath, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, and this is the story of how my own home became a house of horrors. It was a Tuesday morning when the nightmare finally cracked open. I was standing in the kitchen listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant aggressive roar of Victoria's engine as she backed out of the driveway. She was heading off to some exclusive week-long wellness retreat up in the mountains. I stood by the granite countertop, rubbing my grease-scarred hands around my favorite thick ceramic mug. It was an old chipped thing I had kept since my days working as a maintenance engineer down at the Baltimore ports. I spent 40 years of my life fixing massive cargo cranes, wrestling with cold steel, heavy machinery, and industrial grease. I knew how to fix broken things. I knew how to find the structural flaw in a massive piece of equipment and patch it up so it could carry the weight of the world again. But for the last 7 years, the one thing I wanted to fix more than anything was completely out of my hands. My son Mason. Mason is 38 years old now. He used to be a brilliant marine architect. He designed ships, lived on the water, full of life and fire. Then came the car accident. 7 years ago, our lives stopped. The doctors, guided heavily by Victoria's constant intervention and paperwork, told us he was paralyzed from the waist down. Since that day, my strong, vibrant son had been confined to a custom wheelchair, a ghost of the man he used to be. I moved into their guest room to help. You see, Victoria is a small woman, always perfectly manicured, always sharply dressed. She claimed she physically could not lift a grown man. So that became my job. For 2,555 days, my retirement consisted of wrapping my aching, aging arms around my son's waist, lifting his dead weight out of bed, lowering him into his chair, helping him into the shower. I watched his muscles waste away. I watched the light fade completely from his eyes. And through it all, Victoria was there, playing the tragic, devoted wife. She controlled his finances, his diet, his schedule, and every single pill he swallowed. She held the ultimate power over his existence, and by extension, mine. With Victoria gone for the week, I felt a rare, heavy wave of peace wash over the house. The silence was almost deafening, without the sharp clicking of her designer heels on the hardwood floors, or her constant syrupy, sweet voice barking passive-aggressive orders. I took a deep sip of my black coffee. The bitter, familiar taste grounded me. I planned to go into Mason's room in about an hour, wake him gently, maybe wheel him out to the back patio so we could just sit in the sun. Just the two of us, no schedules, no hovering wife. I set the coffee pot back on the warmer. That is when I heard it. It was not the smooth, familiar, rubbery squeak of Mason's wheelchair rolling over the floorboards. It was a heavy, dull thud. Then another. Then a scrape followed by a harsh gasp for air. Someone's shoulder slammed hard into the drywall in the hallway. The sound echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. My blood ran cold. My first instinct, honed by years of living in a rougher part of town before moving into this pristine suburban cage, was that someone had broken in. Victoria had just left the garage door, might have been open a second too long. I silently set my mug down on the counter. I reached into the heavy utility drawer next to the sink and pulled out a solid steel wrench I kept there for quick repairs. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. At 70 years old, my knees are not what they used to be, but my grip is still like a vice. I stepped silently toward the hallway, gripping the cold steel of the wrench, ready to defend my helpless son in the next room. I rounded the corner, raising the weapon. But the breath vanished from my lungs. The wrench slipped from my fingers, hitting the floor with a loud clang, but I barely registered the sound. It was not an intruder. It was Mason. He was out of his wheelchair. He was standing. I froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what my eyes were seeing. Mason was leaning heavily against the hallway wall, his knuckles white as he gripped the doorframe for support. His face was ghostly pale, slick with a thick layer of cold sweat. His legs, the legs I had lifted and carried like lifeless logs for 7 years, were trembling violently, shaking like a newborn deer, trying to find its footing. He was breathing in ragged, desperate gasps, pushing himself forward. He dragged his right foot, planted it, and then forced his left foot to follow. He was walking. Mason. I choked out. The word barely left my throat. My mind short-circuited. Was I having a stroke? Was this a dream? I had spent years praying to a God I barely believed in, for a miracle for my son, to just feel his toes again. And here he was, walking toward me in the dim light of the hallway. I rushed forward, my eyes immediately flooding with hot tears. Mason. Oh my God, son, do not move. You are going to fall. I reached out, ready to catch him, ready to hold him, 1,000 questions exploding in my brain. How is this possible? When did this happen? Why did the doctors not know? But as I got closer, the joy and the shock in my chest slammed into a brick wall. Mason was not smiling. There were no tears of joy on his face. He was not looking at me like a man who had just experienced a medical miracle. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely feral, like an animal backed into a corner. He pushed past my outstretched arms, stumbling into the kitchen. He leaned heavily against the island, his chest heaving. I followed him, completely bewildered. Son, please sit down. Let me call a doctor. Let me call an ambulance. This is a miracle. Mason did not look at me. His trembling hands scrambled over the granite countertop, knocking over a stack of mail, knocking over my favorite ceramic mug. It shattered against the tile floor, sending scalding, black coffee splashing over my work boots. Neither of us cared. His shaking fingers finally closed around my spare set of truck keys. He gripped them so hard his knuckles turned white. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his breathing shallow and erratic. The sheer desperation in his face chilled me to the bone. Dad. Mason whispered, his voice a guttural, raw sound, completely stripped of the lethargic fog he had lived in for the last 2,000 days. We need to go now, before the drugs kick back in. Victoria packed her bags for a retreat. Once her SUV left my son, wheelchair-bound for 7 years, suddenly stood up. He walked into the kitchen, his legs shaking violently, whispering we needed to run before the drugs kicked back in. What I discovered completely shattered my reality and exposed a monster. Before I continue, tell me where you are watching from. Below, hit like and subscribe. I grabbed him. We packed nothing and left the door unlocked. I grabbed him under his armpit to take his weight, but he pushed back. He was helping me. Every step was a jagged battle, but his legs moved. I shoved him into my old Ford pickup, slammed the door, and cranked the ignition. I threw it into reverse. Speeding away, I checked the mirror, expecting Victoria's SUV to block us. The silence in the truck was broken only by Mason gasping for air. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I drove aimlessly, trying to process the impossibility sitting next to me. I glanced over at him. My son was clutching the dashboard, his eyes darting frantically at the passing trees, the houses, the open sky. He looked at the world like a man freed from a lightless box, drinking in the speed. Sweat poured down his temples. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. Mason, I said, my voice shaking in a way it had not shaken since the day his mother died. Mason, talk to me. What is happening? The doctors said your spinal cord was severed. They showed us the scans. They told me you would never feel your legs again. Mason turned his head slowly. The lethargic, empty stare I had grown so used to over the last 7 years was completely gone. In its place was a burning, feral clarity. It was a concussion, Dad. He rasped, his voice raw from disuse. A spinal concussion. That is what the original emergency room doctor said when they pulled me from the wreck. Severe trauma, temporary loss of function, but no severing. I was supposed to start walking again in 6 months. I hit the brakes, pulling the truck hard onto the shoulder of a deserted back road. Dust kicked up around the tires as we slammed to a halt. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, turning fully toward him. "Victoria sat in that hospital room with me. We cried together. The surgeon told us the damage was permanent." Mason let out a bitter laugh. "The surgeon, she picked Dad. The private specialist she insisted on. I was drugged out of my mind on painkillers. She took control of my proxy. She controlled everything." The memories hit me like physical blows to the chest. I remembered those first few weeks after the accident vividly. Victoria had been the picture of a devoted, heartbroken wife. She had quit her high-paying job. She handled all the insurance claims. She managed every single doctor appointment. When we brought Mason home to that custom-built house with the ramps and the wide hallways, she had set up a rigorous medication schedule. I remembered her standing at the kitchen island, perfectly poised, crushing pills into his food or stirring them into his water. Whenever I asked what she was giving him, she would give me that sad, patient smile of hers. "It is a specialized muscle relaxant for his nerve damage, Harrison," she would say, patting my arm. "The doctors say if we do not keep his lower body completely relaxed, the spasms will tear his remaining nerve endings apart. I just want him to be comfortable." I believed her. I praised her. I told everyone in our family how lucky my son was to have a woman who would sacrifice her entire life to care for a paralyzed husband. The truth was entirely different. "It was not a muscle relaxant, Dad," Mason whispered, staring down at his shaking legs. "It was a paralytic. High-grade black market chemical restraints mixed with heavy sedatives. She was chemical caging me, every morning, every night. For 7 years, I was locked inside my own body. I could hear you talking to me. I could feel you carrying me to the shower. But my brain was wrapped in a thick fog, and my muscles simply would not respond to my commands. She made sure I was just lucid enough to sign papers when she guided my hand, but dead enough to never ask questions." My stomach violently turned. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to open my door and spit onto the gravel. 7 years. 2,555 days of watching my son rot away in a chair, thinking God had dealt us a cruel hand, when all along the devil was pouring his morning coffee. I gripped the doorframe, my vision swimming with a rage I had never known existed. She had stolen his 30s. She had stolen his pride, his career, his life. And I had helped her do it by lifting him into that damn chair every single day. I pulled myself back into the driver's seat, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. I looked at Mason. His breathing was starting to steady, but his eyes were still wild. "If she has been keeping you heavily drugged for 7 years, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low octave, "how are you sitting here right now? How did you break through the fog? How are you standing?" Mason leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, the terror had receded, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. "A month ago," he began, his voice steadying, "Victoria made me my morning smoothie. She always put the pills in the smoothie because the taste of the berries hid the chemical bitterness. She set it on the tray, attached to my wheelchair, and went upstairs to take a phone call. I tried to lift the cup, but my hand spasmed. I knocked the entire thing over right off the patio deck." He swallowed hard, looking out the windshield. The neighbor's golden retriever had wandered into our yard. It licked up the spill before I could make a sound. 10 minutes later, I watched that dog collapse on the grass. It started foaming at the mouth. Its back legs completely gave out. It lay there paralyzed, whining in panic for 4 hours until the chemicals finally wore off, and it dragged itself back home. Mason turned to look me dead in the eye. That was when the fog lifted just enough for me to realize what I was drinking. For 30 days I have been pretending to swallow her pills. I would hold them under my tongue, wait for her to turn around, and spit them into my napkin. Every night, while you and she were fast asleep, I would secretly drag myself out of bed and force myself to stand in the dark. I have been quietly building my strength back, just desperately waiting for the day she would finally leave this house. I stared at my son in the passenger seat, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the horror he had just described. For 30 agonizing days he had suffered in absolute silence, trapped in his own home, acting as a prisoner while secretly rebuilding his broken body in the dark. I put the truck back into gear, the heavy tires crunching loudly against the gravel shoulder as I merged back onto the main road. The engine roared, matching the frantic pulse beating wildly in my ears. I asked him where we needed to go, expecting him to name a local police station or a law office downtown. Instead, he stared straight ahead through the dirty windshield and told me to drive to Baltimore Harbor. Specifically, he told me to head directly to Pier 4. I asked him what was waiting for us at Pier 4, but his jaw remained clamped tightly shut. He just shook his head, his breathing still heavy, and labored from the monumental physical effort of walking out of that house unassisted. The silence between us stretched out thick and suffocating, broken only by the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt. As I navigated the winding roads leading toward the city limits, the puzzle pieces of the last 7 years began clicking together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Every strange incident, every fiercely overprotective gesture Victoria had ever made, suddenly morphed from acts of profound love into the calculated moves of a ruthless warden. I remembered the countless times I had begged her to let me take Mason to a new specialist in Boston or New York. I had spent long nights researching experimental therapies and cutting-edge rehabilitation centers that promised hope. Every single time I brought it up, Victoria would break down into hysterical tears. She would weep and clutch her chest, claiming that traveling would only traumatize him further. She insisted that his fragile nervous system could not handle the stress of unfamiliar environments or prodding doctors. I remembered her standing in our kitchen, her eyes red and pleading, telling me that giving him false hope was the absolute cruelest thing we could possibly do to him. She had convinced me that the most loving choice was to keep him comfortable and quiet right there in his custom-built bedroom. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my scarred knuckles ached with a dull throb. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She had weaponized my deep love for my son and used it to silently build the walls of his invisible prison. I had been the oblivious guard maintaining the daily routine she established, lifting his limp body and never once questioning the perfectly measured doses of poison she handed him on a silver tray. I vividly recalled the day she finalized the paperwork, granting her absolute legal and medical power of attorney. She had worn a modest black dress, wiping a single perfect tear from her cheek, as she told the judge that she only wanted to shield Mason from the burdensome administrative stress of his condition. The judge had praised her devotion. I had praised her devotion. We were all completely blinded by her flawless performance. She had systematically isolated him from the outside world, subtly discouraging old friends from visiting by claiming they tired him out too quickly. She even restricted my time with him, insisting that my loud, boisterous energy was detrimental to his delicate healing process. Every single decision she made was a precisely calculated move on a chessboard we did not even know we were playing on. The realization that I had been sharing a roof with a master manipulator, a woman capable of watching her husband suffer daily while faking absolute empathy, made my skin crawl. My hands shook not from age but from the terrifying understanding that she had stolen years of our lives right under my nose. I needed to focus to channel this overwhelming, suffocating anger into something sharp and useful, because the reality of our current situation was far more dangerous than just a simple and deeply disturbing medical deception. The landscape began to change as we neared the industrial outskirts of Baltimore. The familiar sharp scent of salt water and diesel fuel drifted through the open vents of the truck, filling the cabin. In the distance, the towering steel structures of the massive cargo cranes loomed against the gray morning sky. For 4 long decades, those busy docks had been my entire world. I knew every single inch of those mechanical giants by heart. I could easily diagnose a fractured hydraulic line or a failing steel joint just by listening to the sound of the engine groaning under a heavy load. I had spent my entire adult life fixing colossal broken machines, ensuring they could safely bear the crushing weight of global cargo. Yet as I drove past the shipyards, a wave of sickening guilt washed over me, heavy enough to completely drown a man. I was a seasoned mechanic, a professional problem solver, a man who prided himself on seeing the hidden faults in highly complex systems. How could I have been so completely blind to the deliberate dismantling of my own flesh and blood? I had watched my only son waste away under my own roof. I had seen the vacant, hollow look in his eyes and accepted the medical lies without a single fight, all because the woman handing him the pills had a soft voice and a highly convincing smile. The profound shame burned in my throat like battery acid. I should have asked more pointed questions. I should have demanded different independent doctors. I should have tasted the food she gave him. Instead, I had unwittingly helped her tuck him in every single night, believing I was doing the right thing for my broken family. The city traffic thickened as we entered the bustling harbor district. Mason was sweating profusely, the pure adrenaline clearly wearing off as his recovering muscles screamed in silent protest. He gripped the passenger door handle tightly, guiding me through the confusing maze of towering warehouses and stacked shipping containers. I still had absolutely no idea what we were looking for in this particular part of town. I fully expected him to direct me to some shady waterfront clinic, a dilapidated storage unit, or perhaps a hidden lockbox where Victoria kept illicit cash or illegal medical supplies. We took a sharp right turn, passing a rusted chain-link fence, and finally arrived at the heavily guarded entrance of Pier 4. I slowed the heavy truck to a cautious crawl, my tired eyes scanning the surrounding area for whatever dark secret my daughter-in-law was hiding from us. But there were no rundown warehouses here. There were no shady underground clinics. The heavy security gate slowly opened, and as we pulled forward, the industrial grit of the harbor vanished, entirely replaced by an overwhelming display of absurd, untouchable wealth. Mason raised a trembling finger pointing toward the calm water. Moored along the private pristine dock was a long line of massive, gleaming multi-million-dollar luxury yachts. I listened to the harrowing confession of his solitary torment, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached before I finally drove us the rest of the way to Pier 4. I parked the truck, staring at the sleek white hulls reflecting the morning sun, completely unable to comprehend what my son was showing me. We stepped out into the humid harbor air. Mason leaned heavily on my shoulder, his breathing ragged, but his determination absolute. We walked slowly toward the towering security gate that separated the public street from the private slips. Behind the wrought iron fence, a fleet of at least 5 pristine luxury vessels bobbed gently in the dark water. The largest of them all, a massive flagship yacht, with 3 decks and tinted panoramic windows, was moored directly in front of us. Painted across its polished fiberglass hull in elegant sweeping gold lettering was the name Vic Marino. Victoria and Mason. She had named her flagship after the two of them. A bitter taste rose in the back of my throat as the sheer audacity of her massive ego washed over me. I looked at Mason, my voice barely a whisper, as I asked him whose boats these were. He did not blink as he told me the horrifying truth. When the court awarded him a $12 million settlement after the tragic accident, Victoria had taken immediate and total control of the funds. She told me, and she told the entire extended family, that the money was legally locked away in a high-yield, untouchable medical trust. She claimed it would safely cover his lifelong specialized care, his expensive automated equipment, and his daily physical therapy sessions. We all praised her prudent financial planning and her dedication to his future. But there was no medical trust. Mason looked at the gold letters on the hull, and told me that she had drained every single penny of his settlement to purchase this entire charter fleet. While I was changing his bedsheets and spoon-feeding him his dinner, she was building a massive empire with his blood money. The security gate was heavily guarded by a young man in a crisp white uniform standing inside a climate-controlled booth. He stepped out, holding a clipboard clearly ready to turn away an old man in dirty work boots and a stumbling man in sweatpants. But I spent 40 years on these very docks. I knew the language of the harbor better than anyone. I recognized the security badge on his chest. It was from a private contracting firm run by an old friend of mine, Jimmy Callahan. I walked up to the guard, looked him dead in the eye, and told him I was Harrison Cole, Jimmy's old union brother from Pier 9. I said we needed to urgently inspect the electrical junction boxes on the Vic Marino for a potential fire hazard. The young guard hesitated, looked at my grease-stained jacket, looked at my exhausted son, and then tapped his shoulder radio to confirm my story. A few agonizing seconds later, he pressed a green button on his console, and the heavy metal gate slowly slid open. My old port connections still held significant weight. As we walked onto the pristine wooden docks, my seasoned instincts kicked into high gear. I looked around at the sheer scale of the operation surrounding us. Managing a luxury charter fleet of this magnitude is absolutely not a passive investment. It requires daily grueling operations. It demands constant coordination with specialized maintenance crews, managing a large staff of licensed captains and hospitality workers, and handling a massive continuous flow of cash. I remembered how Victoria would come home in the late afternoons, kicking off her designer heels, dramatically rubbing her temples, and complaining about how thoroughly exhausted she was from dealing with the stubborn medical insurance companies all day. She would sigh heavily, pour herself a large glass of expensive wine, and say she just needed an hour of complete silence to recover from the stress of managing his care. She had played the role of the exhausted homebound caregiver, flawlessly putting on an Oscar-worthy performance for my specific benefit. In reality, she was spending her days down here in the bright sunshine, barking orders at her staff, reviewing massive financial ledgers, and running a multi-million-dollar maritime business completely behind our backs. The sheer magnitude of her deception was staggering to process. It required a level of cold, sociopathic calculation that I could not even begin to fathom. She had compartmentalized her life so perfectly that not a single drop of her secret corporate empire ever spilled over into our quiet suburban home. She had smiled in my face every morning while stealing my son's entire future. Mason tugged urgently on my sleeve, pulling my fractured attention away from the floating palaces. He pointed toward a sleek, modern building constructed of tinted glass and dark steel, situated at the far end of the private dock. It was the harbormaster's private office, a highly restricted area meant only for fleet owners and top-level executive management. We moved slowly toward it, every single step an agonizing physical effort for my son. His legs were shaking so violently I thought he might collapse right there on the wooden planks, but pure, unadulterated rage kept him moving forward. I kept my arm firmly wrapped around his waist, supporting his weight, marveling at the sheer willpower radiating from his fragile frame. We finally reached the heavy glass door of the private office. There was no traditional keyhole, only a highly sophisticated biometric lock system, with a digital keypad glowing softly in the morning light. I felt a sudden surge of panic tighten my chest. We had absolutely no way to get inside a secure facility like this. I turned to Mason, ready to tell him we needed to leave immediately before someone asked too many questions and called the police. But Mason simply leaned forward, his face pale and dripping with cold sweat. He looked at the glowing keypad with a terrifyingly calm and calculated expression. "She thinks I am a vegetable, Dad." Mason said, his voice a low, steady rumble that completely lacked any fear. "She thought I was completely dead to the world, trapped in my own mind. She did not realize I was watching her every single move through half-closed eyes. I memorized her master passcode before she drugged me today." He reached out his trembling hand, pressed his thumb against the biometric sensor to wake the screen, and swiftly typed a long code. The heavy door clicks open. We stepped inside, leaving the bright harbor sun behind us, and plunged directly into the dark heart of her meticulously constructed empire. I could feel the cold air conditioning wash over my face, carrying a faint trace of her expensive perfume. We were finally crossing the invisible threshold into her hidden life. The true nightmare of her deception was standing right before my eyes. Every single thing we found inside this room was going to completely change the entire trajectory of our shattered family lives forever. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind us, completely sealing off the sounds of the bustling harbor and the cries of the seagulls circling the docks. We were entirely enveloped in a sudden suffocating silence. The harbor master's private office was a masterclass in modern unapologetic luxury. The floors were polished dark mahogany gleaming flawlessly beneath recessed lighting that cast a soft warm glow across the spacious room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire private marina, perfectly framing the fleet of immaculate yachts Victoria had purchased with my son's stolen future. A massive, sleek desk carved from solid walnut dominated the center of the room, completely devoid of any family photographs or personal mementos. There were no pictures of Mason. There was absolutely nothing in this opulent sanctuary to indicate that the woman who ran this maritime empire had a paralyzed husband rotting away in a custom-built suburban prison. She had meticulously separated her two worlds. This pristine office was the ultimate monument to her towering sociopathic greed. I guided Mason toward a heavy leather chair, positioned in front of the sweeping windows, my own muscles burning with the sheer effort of supporting his trembling frame. He collapsed into the deep cushions, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. His face was slick with a fresh layer of cold sweat, his skin possessing a sickly, translucent pallor that made my heart ache with a violent, protective fury. I asked him if he needed water, if we needed to stop for just a single minute, but he violently shook his head. He raised a shaking hand and pointed toward a large, abstract canvas hanging on the far wall. It was a chaotic swirl of deep blues and silvers blending perfectly into the nautical theme of the room. He told me to pull the canvas down. I walked over, gripped the edges of the heavy wooden frame, and forcefully yanked it off the wall, letting it clatter loudly onto the mahogany floorboards. Behind the painting set deep into the reinforced steel framework of the building was a massive state-of-the-art wall safe. It featured a sleek matte black finish and a highly sophisticated digital touchscreen keypad that immediately illuminated the moment my shadow passed over its motion sensors. I stared at the glowing numbers, feeling a sudden, crushing wave of total defeat wash over me. The safe was commercial grade, the kind used by diamond brokers and high-end casinos to secure millions in untraceable assets. There was absolutely no way we were getting inside without heavy explosives or a team of professional safecrackers. I turned back to Mason, ready to tell him that we had hit a permanent dead end, that we needed to leave this office immediately and find a different way to expose her massive web of lies. But my son did not look defeated. He did not look like a man who was ready to surrender. He slowly pushed himself up from the leather chair, utilizing every single ounce of strength he had secretly cultivated during those long, agonizing nights in his dark bedroom. I rushed to his side to brace his shoulder, feeling the violent tremors racking his emaciated body. He waved me off, gritting his teeth in raw defiance. He limped toward the glowing keypad, his eyes completely locked onto the digital screen, with a terrifying laser-focused intensity. He placed his left hand against the cold steel of the wall to steady himself and raised his right hand toward the illuminated numbers. I asked him what he was doing, completely bewildered by his sudden burst of manic determination. Without turning his head, he explained his desperate, brilliant strategy. He told me that for the last 3 weeks, while Victoria firmly believed he was entirely unresponsive and trapped in a heavy drug-induced coma, he had been meticulously studying her every single movement. He had watched her routinely open her personal tablet, her banking applications, and her private encrypted folders. He had silently observed the precise rhythm of her fingers, the tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in her body language, and the exact sequence of numbers she favored when she thought absolutely no one in the world was watching her. He explained that a woman as relentlessly controlling and intensely arrogant as Victoria would never rely on a random-generated security sequence. She would use a mathematical pattern, something deeply rooted in her own twisted logic, an algorithm that she felt made her undeniably smarter than everyone else around her. Mason had spent hundreds of hours locked in his wheelchair, completely unable to speak or move, doing nothing but calculating those specific sequences in his mind. He had turned his silent chemical prison into a mental war room. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand hovering over the glowing keypad. He punched in a complex string of 12 digits, his fingers moving with a sudden, surprising fluidity that betrayed his severe physical exhaustion. He paused for a fraction of a second, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter under the immense pressure. Then he pressed the final key. The digital screen flashed a bright, vibrant green. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed loudly from deep within the thick steel door, followed by the smooth, satisfying hiss of the motorized locking bolts sliding back into their chambers. The heavy door swung open, revealing the dark, cavernous interior of the safe. I stood completely paralyzed, absolutely stunned by the sheer brilliance of my son. He slumped heavily against the wall, utterly exhausted, gesturing for me to empty the contents. I stepped forward and reached into the cold metal cavity. The safe was packed to the absolute brim with neatly organized manila folders, thick legal binders, and heavy stacks of official banking documents. I pulled the first stack out and dropped it onto the massive walnut desk. The truth was finally staring us directly in the face, and it was infinitely more horrifying than I could have ever possibly imagined. There were dozens of statements from offshore banking institutions located in the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, and Switzerland. Every single account was registered under a complex web of anonymous holding companies, but Victoria was clearly listed as the sole primary beneficiary on every single ledger. I opened a thick black binder and found the original documents from Mason and his accident settlement. The $12 million had not been locked away in a protective medical trust, as she had tearfully claimed to our entire family. She had systematically, ruthlessly siphoned every last dime of his blood money through these offshore shell corporations to cleanly purchase this luxurious charter fleet outright. She had effectively washed the money, turning his tragic accident into her own personal, untraceable fortune. As I furiously shoved the damning documents into my heavy canvas bag, a specific thick contract suddenly caught my eye, slipping out from between two leather binders. It was a formal promissory note stamped with ominous red legal seals. Victoria did not just buy the luxury yachts outright. She was currently aggressively leveraging the entire massive maritime luxury fleet today. My hands shook violently as I pulled the thick parchment completely out of the heavy leather binder. The document was bound with a thick black cord and stamped with ominous, deep red wax seals that looked entirely out of place for a standard commercial bank loan. I smoothed the heavy pages flat against the polished walnut surface of the harbormaster desk, my eyes desperately scanning the dense paragraphs of highly complex legal jargon. The silence in the opulent office was absolute, broken only by the ragged, labored breathing of my exhausted son sitting in the leather chair beside me. I leaned over the desk, tracing my calloused index finger along the meticulously typed lines of text. Victoria had indeed used the $12 million from Mason and his settlement to purchase the impressive fleet of luxury yachts moored just outside the tinted panoramic windows. However, she was not content to simply run a highly profitable, legitimate maritime charter business. The document laid out perfectly clear evidence that she was using the physical vessels as collateral to secure an unimaginably massive injection of liquid cash. I read the total principal amount twice, blinking hard to ensure my aging eyes were not deceiving me in the dim light of the office. The loan was for an astonishing $20 million. My mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of that number. Why would a woman who already controlled a thriving multi-million-dollar fleet desperately need an immediate cash injection of $20 million? I flipped to the second page of the dense contract, searching for the name of the financial institution or corporate lending group that had authorized such a colossal transaction. What I found instead sent a jagged shard of pure, unadulterated ice straight down my spine. There was no legitimate commercial bank listed anywhere on the document. The lender was listed only as a highly obscure private equity holding firm based out of an industrial sector in northern New Jersey. I had spent 40 long years working on the gritty, unforgiving cargo docks of the East Coast and handling massive freight contracts for various shipping companies. I knew exactly how the dark underbelly of the maritime shipping industry operated in the shadows. I recognized the specific name of the holding company immediately. It was a well-known, heavily insulated front for a notoriously brutal organized crime syndicate that controlled the underground ports from Baltimore all the way up to Boston. They were absolutely not the kind of men who negotiated missed payments over polite phone calls or sent stern letters through corporate lawyers or allowed anyone to casually walk away from their obligations. They were the kind of men who settled their outstanding debts with overwhelming catastrophic violence. I quickly read through the deeply buried repayment clauses, my stomach violently churning with every single horrifying sentence. The terms of the underground loan were explicitly, deliberately designed to be impossible to fulfill. The interest rates were astronomically high, compounding weekly at a rate that would bankrupt a small nation. The collateral clauses did not just lay claim to the physical yachts floating outside. They included blanket liens on every single piece of property, every investment account, and every personal asset associated with the borrower. The implicit threat woven into the cold legal text was unmistakable and utterly devoid of any mercy or room for negotiation. Defaulting on this massive underground debt did not simply mean losing the business or facing financial ruin. It meant a guaranteed death sentence. Victoria had intentionally walked directly into the lion den and taken $20 million in untraceable cash from the most dangerous criminals on the entire eastern seaboard. I grabbed the edge of the heavy desk to steady my trembling legs and took a slow, deep breath to calm my racing heart, completely unable to comprehend the sheer scale of her monumental arrogance. But the true, horrifying depth of her sociopathic brilliance did not fully hit me until I flipped frantically to the very last page of the binding contract. I stared down at the signature line located at the bottom right corner of the document. Victoria had not signed her own name to secure the $20 million. There, written in bold, flawless blue ink, was the signature of my son. It was a completely perfect, indistinguishable forgery of Mason and his handwriting. She had meticulously copied the exact loops and harsh angles of his signature, legally binding him to the most dangerous debt imaginable. I felt the air completely vanish from my lungs. She had taken the $20 million in pure, untraceable cash for herself, leaving us completely trapped, but she had deliberately left the catastrophic debt entirely in his name. When the brutal men from the New Jersey crime syndicate inevitably came looking to collect their massive repayment, they would not be looking for Victoria. They would be hunting down the man whose signature was on the dotted line. They would be coming directly for my paralyzed, defenseless son. She had effectively painted a massive glowing target right on his chest. If she vanished with the money, the mob would tear through our lives, destroy our home, and mercilessly kill him to balance their ledgers. She was setting him up to take the ultimate fall for her monumental theft. I slowly turned my head to look at Mason. He was watching my face with a deeply hollow, terrified expression, reading the absolute panic spreading across my features. He asked me what I had found in the paperwork. I could not even find the breath to form the necessary words to explain the horrific reality of our current situation. I simply handed him the final page of the heavy contract. He stared down at his own perfectly forged signature, his eyes wide and unblinking. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths as the terrifying implications of the document finally settled over him. We were no longer just dealing with a greedy, manipulative wife who had stolen his initial medical settlement. We were now dealing with highly organized professional killers who held a legally binding claim to his very existence. My eyes darted back to the top of the final page drawn to the tiny black numbers stamped next to the official notary seal. It was the exact date the catastrophic loan execution had been formally finalized and officially recorded into the underground system. I read the date 3 times over a sickening wave of pure terror washing over my entire body. The massive financial transaction had been fully completed and signed just 3 days ago. Victoria had received the $20 million in liquid cash exactly 72 hours before she packed her expensive designer bags and cheerfully announced she was leaving town for a relaxing wellness retreat in the quiet mountains. I looked up from the desk meeting my son and his terrified, bloodshot eyes. The dark, terrifying truth finally shattered the last remaining illusions I held about the woman living under my roof. She is not at a wellness retreat. Mason, I growled, the blood completely draining from my face. She is undoubtedly securing her escape route. The heavy truck engine roared like a caged beast, a guttural mechanical protest that seemed to mock the fragile, uneasy silence of the harbor. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, the heavy tires screeching against the coarse asphalt as I swung us away from that dock of stolen dreams and hidden agendas. I did not care about the speed limit, the red lights, or the startled looks of the few harbor workers who paused to watch our frantic departure. I drove like a man possessed by the singular burning need to put as much distance as humanly possible between my son and the life-ending trap he had been lured into. Mason sat beside me, the thick, heavy stack of documents clutched to his chest like a holy shield. His knuckles were stark white, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, as if he expected a black sedan to come screaming around every corner, hungry for our blood. My brain was firing, processing every piece of information we had just pulled from that safe. It felt like I was back on the port, frantically diagnosing a massive, catastrophic engine failure. Except the machine in question was the only life I had left to protect. I referenced the data I had mentally logged, specifically the terrifying details outlined in the reports contained within Kuangmao 1_13.docx, which clearly laid out the timeline of Victoria's financial predation. Why would a woman who had already liquidated a $12 million settlement suddenly need $20 million more? It made no sense. It was irrational. It was greedy. Unless, of course, the goal was never long-term, comfortable stability, but a final explosive and permanent exit. The weight of that thought was like lead in my stomach. I pushed the accelerator further, the old engine whining in protest. We needed to get to a place where we could think, where we could breathe away from the prying eyes of the harbor. I started speaking, my voice low and gravelly, forcing Mason to look at me. I needed him to understand that we were not just running from a thief. We were running from a predator. The math did not add up for a simple flight. Victoria was far too smart, far too calculated to think she could just vanish to a tropical island with $20 million and assume the mob would just shrug and move on. Those people did not work like that. They were persistent, they were violent, and they had a memory that spanned generations. It hit me then, a cold, sickening realization that stopped my heart for a fraction of a second. The information in Kuangmao 2_13.docx offered the perfect, brutal context for what we were dealing with. She had not just stolen the money, she had created a debt that was impossible to repay. A debt that was tied to a life. The syndicate would not hunt her down in the Caribbean. They would hunt the debtor. And that debtor, according to their documents, was Mason. She was setting the stage for a tragic, clean-cut end. A paralyzed man drowning in debt to dangerous men finally choosing to end his own suffering. It was the perfect narrative, a story the mob would accept and the police would not question. Every mile we put between ourselves and the harbor felt like an eternity. Mason began to speak, his voice raspy and thin, telling me about the late nights in his room, how he would listen to her on the phone, the hushed tones, the cold business-like way she talked about expiring assets and final settlements. I had been so blind. I had spent my life fixing engines, ensuring the giant steel beasts on the pier could bear their loads without buckling yet. I could not see the structural weakness in my own son's marriage until it had already collapsed around our ears. My heart ached as I looked at him. He had been a prisoner, a ghost in his own house, and I was the one who had pushed the wheelchair. I had been the one to feed him, to bathe him, all the while thinking I was the good father, the protector. I had been the unwitting accomplice, the final link in the chain that held him down. The guilt was a physical weight heavier than the cargo ships I used to load. Every time I had let her take him, let her manage his care, I was just making her grip on him tighter. She told me she was taking the money to buy more medical equipment. Dad Mason said, his eyes unfocused as he looked out the window. She said the trust would last forever. Forever. That was the word that kept echoing in my mind. She had bought herself a forever with our lives, and now she was selling us to the highest bidder to fund her departure. It was not just greed. It was pure distilled contempt. She looked at us, at my son, at me, and saw nothing but a means to an end. We were resources to be mined, and once the vein was tapped dry, we were to be discarded. She had planned this for years. The accident, the recovery, the isolation. Every part of it was a stage in her master plan. And the most chilling part was that she had actually been proud of it. I had seen her smile, that calm, serene smile, when she told me about the progress Mason was making. She was enjoying the performance, enjoying the way she could manipulate all of us into believing her lies. The abandoned shopping center appeared on the horizon, its vast, empty parking lot, a sea of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. It was the perfect place to stop. No prying eyes, no traffic, no witnesses to the collapse of our world. I slowed the truck, the engine sputtering as I turned into the lot. The silence of the place, the stillness, it mirrored the emptiness in my own chest. I killed the ignition. The world went silent save for the wind whistling through the rusted light poles. I turned to Mason, taking the documents from his hands and laying them on the dashboard. I pointed to the final page, the date of the execution. 3 days ago. It was not a coincidence. It was a deadline. She had executed the loan just as she was setting the stage for her wellness retreat. She was clearing her desk, burning her secrets, and ensuring that by the time anyone realized she was gone, we would be the ones holding the debt, and we would be the ones facing the syndicate's wrath. The cold truth was like a blade in my hands. I was the father, the protector, the man who had worked his entire life to ensure they would have safety. And I had failed so spectacularly that I had not even realized my son was being sold to a mob syndicate. I gripped the dashboard, the plastic groaning under my hands. I looked at him, my son who had survived so much, only to face this. The finality of the promissory note lay there, a death warrant signed in his own handwriting. I could see the pieces falling into place for Mason too. The realization that he was not just a victim of an accident, but a victim of a plan. He had been kept alive for a specific reason, not because she loved him, but because she needed him. And now that she was ready to move on, she did not need him anymore. She was coming back to finish the job. I stared at the horizon, the sun climbing higher, mocking our terror. We had the evidence, but we were out of time. She was probably already on her way, thinking she was free, thinking she had finally gotten away with everything. She had no idea that we were standing in the middle of a dead lot, with the proof of her crimes in our hands, and the knowledge of her true intent burning in our minds. I turned back to Mason, my heart heavy with the weight of the words I had to say, knowing that after this there was no going back, no pretending, no peace. The truth was out, and it was the most dangerous thing I had ever held. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt the true suffocating burden of being a father who had been given a second chance only to be hit with a terminal diagnosis of reality. "She's not at a wellness retreat, Mason?" I growled, the words barely making it out of my constricted throat, as the blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling colder than I ever thought possible. "She's securing her escape route. She is coming back here, Mason. She is coming back to finish this. She is coming back to kill you." The silence in the truck cabin shattered as Mason let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized his features. His hands flew to the door handle, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tugged at the latch. He practically screamed that we needed to drive straight to the local police precinct. He wanted to throw the stack of forged offshore bank statements and the life-threatening promissory note directly onto a detective desk. He wanted to demand an immediate arrest, begging for squad cars to rush to the airport or the mountain resort or wherever Victoria was currently hiding. His chest heaved with frantic, shallow breaths as he visualized handing the authorities the key to his salvation. I understood his raw desperation perfectly. Every instinct screaming within my own chest urged me to do the exact same thing, to seek the immediate safety of armed officers and sterile interrogation rooms. But my mind was already racing several steps ahead, mapping out the cold, terrifying reality of the legal battlefield we had unwittingly entered. I reached out and firmly gripped his trembling shoulder, squeezing hard enough to ground him, to pull him back from the edge of absolute hysteria. I looked him dead in the eye and forcefully told him no. I kept my voice low and steady, forcing an ironclad calmness I did not truly feel. I explained the grim, insurmountable wall we were currently facing. Victoria held the absolute medical and legal high ground. She possessed the ironclad power of attorney signed by a judge granting her total control over his entire existence. If we walked into a police station right now carrying a wild story about international mob loans, offshore accounts, and secret paralytic drugs, the local cops would not immediately arrest a well-dressed, grieving caregiver. They would look at a man who was supposed to be completely paralyzed, a man sweating and raving about conspiracies, and they would immediately call his legal guardian. They would call Victoria. She would walk into that precinct with her perfect, sorrowful smile and a briefcase full of meticulously forged medical records. She would softly explain to the desk sergeant that her dear traumatized husband was suffering from severe drug-induced psychosis. She would weep and claim his fractured mind had finally snapped under the tragic weight of his condition. And the police, utterly convinced by her flawless performance, would hand him right back to her. They would give her the legal justification to lock him away in a secure psychiatric ward permanently, and I would have absolutely no legal standing to prevent it. Mason stared at me, the frantic light in his eyes slowly dying, replaced by a cold, hollow understanding. The brilliant trap she had built was not just physical. It was a psychological and legal fortress. She had spent 7 years conditioning the entire world to view her as a saint and him as a broken, dependent invalid. If we moved prematurely, if we showed our hand without absolute, undeniable proof of her active intent to commit murder, she would effortlessly twist the narrative. She would paint us as two delusional men lashing out against the very woman who had sacrificed everything to care for us. The mob debt would remain the target on his back, would stay locked in place, and we would be entirely defenseless. I told him that we were no longer just fighting a greedy spouse. We were dealing with a highly calculating apex predator who had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise from our living room couch. To catch a predator of this caliber, we could not just play defense. We had to build a mousetrap. We needed irrefutable, indisputable proof of her attempting the final murder, caught in the absolute act, with no possible way to spin her lies. I outlined the agonizing plan, my heart breaking. With every single word I forced myself to speak. We had to go back to the house. We had to return to the scene of the crime before she realized we had ever left. We needed to beat her back to the pristine suburban prison she had built. I told Mason that he had to get back into the wheelchair. He had to voluntarily surrender his newly reclaimed mobility and play the role of the helpless, paralyzed victim one last time. We needed to set up hidden cameras. We needed to position ourselves perfectly, anticipating her final, lethal move when she returned to cash out her deadly insurance policy. The sheer cruelty of what I was asking my son to do tore at my soul. I was asking a man who had spent 2,500 days trapped in a silent nightmare to willingly step back into his cage. I was asking him to look the devil in the eye and pretend he was still completely dead inside. But it was the only way to guarantee she would not escape justice, and more importantly, it was the only way to ensure the violent men she owed $20 million to would turn their crosshairs onto her rather than hunting us down. The drive back to the house was the longest, most agonizing journey of my entire life. We avoided the main highways, sticking exclusively to the winding, deserted back roads to ensure we were not being followed by any of her hired staff or private security. The silence in the truck was heavy, thick, with the shared understanding of the terrifying performance we were about to stage. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting bright, mocking rays of light across the passing suburban lawns. Everything looked so utterly normal, so completely mundane, while our entire reality had been ripped apart and rebuilt into a terrifying thriller. I mentally rehearsed every single step we needed to take. I planned where to hide my phone to record the audio, which specific angles would capture the doorway, and how I would position myself in the adjacent hallway when she finally walked through the front door. I had to play my part flawlessly, too. I had to remain the clueless, grieving father, entirely oblivious to the monster standing in my kitchen. We finally turned onto our familiar street, the manicured lawns and perfectly painted mailboxes looking like the set of a grotesque play. I pulled the heavy truck into the driveway, the engine cutting out with a final metallic shudder. The house stood before us, quiet and imposing. We walked through the front door, the heavy silence of the empty rooms pressing down on us like a physical weight. We moved slowly into the living room. There, sitting perfectly still in the center of the plush rug, was the motorized wheelchair. It was the absolute symbol of his 7-year torture. Mason stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the heavy leather straps. His hands balled into tight fists, his entire body trembling violently, with tears of unadulterated rage. With a sharp, shuddering breath, he stepped forward, lowered himself back down into the chair, and began strapping his useless-looking legs tightly into the metal footrests. The trap was finally set for her return. I watched my son strap his lifeless legs into the cold metal footrests of his wheelchair. The sight of him returning to that mechanical prison shattered my heart, but we had no choice. We were hunters now, and Victoria was our prey. The trap was set, but it was useless without eyes and ears. I needed undeniable evidence of her malicious intent, captured in high definition and stored far beyond her reach. I sprinted out to my pickup truck. During 4 decades at the docks, I frequently dealt with security contractors to monitor the billions in freight moving through our port. Over the years, I accumulated a military-grade toolkit of diagnostic cameras, microlenses, and encrypted audio bugs designed for inspecting inaccessible engine cavities. I grabbed my canvas tool bag, my mind shifting from a grieving father into a cold, focused engineer. I rushed back inside, dropping the heavy bag onto the pristine hardwood floor. I told Mason to stay perfectly still while I went to work. I pulled out precision screwdrivers, high-gauge optical wire, and 3 undetectable microlenses. My calloused hands, scarred from decades of wrestling steel, moved with delicate grace. I dragged a chair to the wall and climbed up, reaching the chrome HVAC vent perfectly positioned near the ceiling. It offered an unobstructed view of the living space focused entirely on Mason. I unscrewed the cover and reached deep into the dusty metallic throat of the air duct. I spliced the microlens directly into the power supply of the digital thermostat, ensuring the camera would have a continuous stream of power. I mounted the lens behind the slats of the vent cover, rendering it completely invisible. I ran the optical wire back to a hidden transmitter unit, hardwiring it directly to an encrypted cellular hotspot I concealed within the wall cavity. The video and audio feeds would instantly upload to a secure cloud server, bypassing the local home network Victoria monitored. If she cut the power to the house or destroyed the router, our evidence would still be safely locked away hundreds of miles away. I secured the living room vent and immediately moved into the kitchen. The kitchen was the central hub of her daily operations, the exact place where she meticulously prepared his poisoned meals and crushed his paralytic pills into his morning smoothies. I found an intake vent located directly above the sprawling marble island. I worked even faster now, my heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I unscrewed the great wired-a-second micro-lens and positioned a highly sensitive audio bug designed to pick up even the faintest whispers. I wanted to capture every word she muttered, every phone call to her offshore bankers, and every clink of the pill crusher against the marble countertop. I connected the kitchen feed to the hidden hotspot, wiping the thin layer of drywall dust from my sweating forehead with the back of my sleeve. I was racing against an invisible, terrifying clock, constantly waiting for the sound of tires pulling into the driveway. Next, I moved swiftly down the carpeted hallway and stepped into the master bedroom. The air in the room was heavy with the suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume. The luxurious king-sized bed, the massive walk-in closet, and the pristine vanity all made my stomach turn. This was the nest she built with my son and his stolen future. I forced the burning anger down and focused on the task at hand. I located a ceiling vent positioned directly above her bedside table and her private desk. I removed the cover and installed the third and final microlens, pairing it with a specialized audio bug. If she made calls to her handlers, or if she confirmed her exit strategy while packing her bags in the dead of night, I would have every syllable recorded. I carefully replaced the vent cover, ensuring the screws were perfectly aligned in their original positions, so she would not notice a single detail out of place. I gathered my tools, zipped the canvas bag shut, and rushed back down the hallway, but my work was not entirely finished. We needed to know exactly where she was going when she left the house. We needed to track her every movement, to anticipate her final lethal strike. I bypassed the living room and slipped quietly through the side door, leading directly into the attached two-car garage. Her primary SUV was missing, currently parked at whatever luxurious wellness center she was using as her alibi. However, her secondary vehicle, a sleek, dark gray luxury sedan she rarely drove, was parked in the bay. I dropped onto my back and slid smoothly underneath the rear chassis of the car, the cold concrete seeping through my thin cotton shirt. I pulled a compact military-grade GPS tracking module from my pocket. It was a heavy-duty, magnetic unit designed to withstand severe weather and rough terrain, originally meant for tracking high-value shipping containers across the country. I reached up into the dark, greasy underbelly of the vehicle, feeling around the suspension components, until I found a secure, deeply hidden recess located just above the rear axle. I pressed the heavy magnet against the solid steel frame, feeling it snap securely into place with a firm, satisfying click. I activated the unit, watching the tiny red LED light blink twice, confirming it established a strong connection with the global positioning satellites. I slid back out from under the car, wiping the thick black grease from my hands onto a rag I pulled from my tool bag. I stood up, taking a deep, shuddering breath, feeling the massive adrenaline spike slowly beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion in my bones. I had successfully transformed her pristine suburban sanctuary into a fully operational, high-tech surveillance grid. I walked back into the living room, grabbing my canvas tool bag from the floor. I looked over at Mason. He was sitting perfectly still in his wheelchair, his head tilted slightly forward, his eyes half closed flawlessly, resuming the tragic role of the broken, paralyzed victim. I gave him a curt, reassuring nod. The invisible trap was armed, the cameras were rolling, the audio bugs were listening. All we had to do now was wait for the predator to step into the crosshairs. I knelt down beside the dining room wall, picking up my precision screwdriver to tighten the very last screw on the HVAC vent cover. I gave the metal grate a final careful wipe with my sleeve, brushing a light dusting of white drywall powder off my knees and onto the rug. I took a step back, visually inspecting the room to guarantee everything was utterly flawless. Just as I turned toward Mason to tell him we were finally ready, a sharp, piercing electronic chime echoed loudly through the silent house. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of the digital smart lock on the front door waking up. My racing heart completely stopped in my chest. Someone was rapidly punching the 6-digit access code into the electronic keypad. The electronic chime of the front door smart lock shattered the suffocating silence of the living room. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a massive sledgehammer. Victoria was supposed to be at her luxurious mountain wellness retreat for an entire week. This was only day 5. She was returning a full 2 days early. Panic, cold, and terrifyingly sharp flooded my veins. I looked over at Mason, who was already slumped heavily in his motorized wheelchair, his chin resting against his chest in a flawless imitation of a heavily sedated vegetable. I had mere seconds to transform myself from a frantic, calculating investigator back into a tired, oblivious old man. I dove for the worn leather armchair positioned near the large bay window. I snatched yesterday's early morning newspaper from the small coffee table, snapped it open, and threw my reading glasses onto the bridge of my nose. I forced my rapid breathing to slow, commanding my entire body to exude the heavy, bone-deep exhaustion of a dedicated, overwhelmed caregiver. I draped a thin wool blanket over my lap, completely concealing the faint traces of white drywall dust that still clung stubbornly to the denim fabric of my jeans. The heavy mahogany front door swung open with a soft, ominous creak. Victoria stepped over the threshold, pulling a sleek designer leather rolling suitcase behind her. She did not look like a woman returning from a deeply relaxing meditation and yoga retreat. She radiated a chilling, tightly coiled energy, like a predatory cat returning to inspect its territory. She wore a tailored black trench coat over a pristine white silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, immediately began darting around the entryway, scanning the floors, the baseboards, and the subtle placement of the furniture. She was silently checking for any microscopic disruption in her meticulously controlled environment. I let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rustling the thick pages of my newspaper as I pretended to just notice her unexpected arrival. I looked up over the rims of my glasses, forcing a warm, weary smile onto my face. I asked her why she was home so early, injecting just the right amount of innocent, grandfatherly surprise into my gravelly voice. I told her we were not expecting her until Sunday evening. Victoria paused in the center of the foyer, her piercing gaze locking onto my face. She offered a smooth, perfectly practiced smile that completely failed to reach her cold eyes. She claimed the retreat had been absolutely wonderful, but she simply could not bear to be away from her 2 favorite men for another single minute. Her sweet, melodic words dripped with a terrifying synthetic honey. I knew the absolute truth. She had not been meditating in the mountains. She had been aggressively finalizing her massive $20 million mob loan, securing the offshore accounts, and preparing her permanent exit strategy. She left her expensive luggage sitting by the heavy wooden door and began a slow, deliberate patrol of the ground floor. I watched her over the top edge of the financial section, my stomach twisting into violent, sickening knots. She walked with measured, completely silent steps, moving past the living room and heading straight toward the open kitchen. The hidden micro-lens I had just wired into the air conditioning vent was tracking her every single move, silently uploading her deadly reality directly to our secure offshore server. She stopped at the massive marble island. My breath caught in my throat, freezing painfully in my lungs. Sitting right next to the polished stainless steel espresso machine was Mason and his weekly pill dispenser. It was a brightly colored plastic container, carefully separated by days and exact times, holding the lethal cocktail of black market paralytics and heavy sedatives she used to maintain his invisible prison. When we had frantically returned to the house just 30 minutes ago, I had painstakingly replaced her toxic capsules with perfectly matched, harmless vitamin supplements. Mason and I had desperately worked together, emptying the capsules and refilling them with crushed dietary powder. We had measured them, weighed them, and arranged them to look entirely untouched. But a brilliant, highly calculating woman like Victoria did not ever overlook tiny details. She picked up the plastic dispenser. I squeezed the newspaper so hard, the thin paper began to tear under my sweating fingertips. I prayed silently, begging the universe that I had placed the dummy pills in the exact correct sequence and that the powder color was a flawless match. She held the translucent plastic up to the bright overhead kitchen lights, her dark eyes narrowing as she scrutinized the contents. She tilted the container, watching the chalky white capsules shift and slide against the plastic walls. The silence in the house stretched out into a terrifying, agonizing eternity. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds to our potential destruction. If she noticed even a slight variation in the weight or the specific powdery texture of the pills, she would instantly know her absolute control had been fundamentally compromised. She would immediately know we had discovered her horrific secret, and the trap we had meticulously built would instantly collapse around us, leaving us entirely at her mercy. After what felt like a lifetime of suffocating terror, Victoria slowly lowered the plastic dispenser. She placed it gently back onto the cold marble countertop, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the espresso machine exactly where it belonged. A quiet, terrifyingly calm sigh escaped her pale lips. The dummy pills had successfully passed her rigorous visual inspection. The grand illusion of her total dominance remained entirely intact. She turned her attention away from the kitchen and began walking slowly back into the main living room, her expensive designer heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. She moved directly toward my son. Mason sat absolutely motionless in his heavy motorized wheelchair, his head lolling pathetically to the side, his jaw slightly slack. It was a masterful, heartbreaking performance of total, unquestioning submission. I sat frozen in my armchair, watching the predator stalk her prey. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to jump up to physically tear her away from him. But I knew I had to remain entirely motionless and let the hidden surveillance grid do its essential work. The intimate gestures she was about to make were meant to look loving and deeply affectionate, but witnessing them now, knowing the monstrous truth of her criminal intentions and her mob debt, it was completely repulsive. My blood froze as she approached. I strained to listen, gripping the wooden arms of my chair so tightly, my knuckles ached. She kept her voice incredibly low, ensuring I could not hear her from across the room, but she completely forgot about the highly sensitive audio bugs hidden directly above her head. Victoria walks over to Mason, strokes his hair with terrifying fake affection, and whispers, "You've been such a good boy while I was gone. It's almost time for you to rest for good." Those whispered words hung in the stagnant air of the living room, heavy and dripping with a lethal finality. I forced my tense muscles to relax completely, burying the violent primal urge to leap from my leather armchair and physically tear her away from my son. I let out a soft, oblivious chuckle from behind my newspaper, expertly playing the pathetic part of the tired, naive old man who had simply misheard her sinister promise. I asked her what she was whispering about, carefully injecting a tone of mild grandfatherly curiosity into my gravelly voice. Victoria slowly stood up, smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from her pristine white blouse with a perfectly practiced grace. She offered me that same chilling synthetic smile and softly claimed she was merely telling Mason how much she had deeply missed his quiet company in the cold mountains. The sheer ease with which she delivered the blatant lie made my blood run entirely cold. She then turned her back to us and walked confidently into the kitchen to begin the agonizing daily routine of preparing his dinner. I carefully folded my newspaper and followed her, taking my usual seat at the edge of the massive marble kitchen island. My heart pounded a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I wrapped my scarred hands around a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. I watched her move around the kitchen with the terrifying efficiency of a seasoned executioner. She retrieved the brightly colored plastic pill dispenser from its spot next to the expensive espresso machine. The hidden microlens I had previously installed in the air conditioning vent directly above her head was silently recording every single calculated motion she made. I forced myself to take a slow, deliberate sip of my bitter coffee, offering her a tired, grateful smile as she reached into the dark cabinet for a heavy ceramic mortar and pestle. Every fiber of my being screamed to grab her by the throat and demand answers about the $20 million mob loan she had ruthlessly anchored to my son. But I knew that any premature confrontation would instantly destroy our fragile, meticulously constructed trap. I had to sit there in absolute silence and endure the profound psychological torture of watching her prepare his daily poison. She opened the Wednesday compartment of the pill dispenser, her manicured fingers expertly extracting the thick, chalky capsules I had desperately swapped just hours prior. She dropped the harmless vitamin powder into the ceramic bowl and began to crush it with methodical, rhythmic strikes. I casually asked her about the specific details of her wellness retreat, forcing her to weave an intricate, completely fabricated tale about mountain hiking and deep meditation sessions while she systematically grounded the white powder into a fine paste. She stirred the powder into a bowl of pureed chicken and vegetables, humming a soft, cheerful melody under her breath as she prepared the toxic slurry. She picked up the ceramic bowl and walked back into the living room, her expensive designer heels clicking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I followed closely behind her, carrying a folded white cloth napkin, maintaining the established routine of a dutiful, supportive father assisting with the evening feeding. Mason sat absolutely motionless in his heavy motorized wheelchair, his head tilted downward, his jaw slightly slack. He played his part flawlessly, a masterful and deeply tragic performance of total, unquestioning submission. Victoria knelt gracefully beside his chair, scooping a small portion of the pureed mixture onto a silver spoon. She brought the spoon to his lips, speaking to him in a high, overly sweet voice usually reserved for infants or beloved pets. She told him to open wide, promising that he would feel so much better after he finished his special dinner. Mason slowly parted his lips, allowing her to slide the metal spoon into his mouth. I stood just 3 feet away, my hands clenched so tightly around the white linen napkin that my knuckles burned. I watched as he let the thick, heavily drugged food pool behind his teeth, completely refusing to swallow a single drop. His acting was so incredibly convincing that for a terrifying fraction of a second, I genuinely feared the dummy pills had somehow been compromised. He held the slurry in his mouth, waiting for the exact perfect moment to execute the countermeasure he had practiced in the dark for 30 agonizing days. Victoria turned her head slightly to the left, reaching blindly toward the small side table to grab a glass of water to wash down the terrible meal. The second her dark eyes shifted away from his face, Mason initiated the desperate maneuver. He suddenly jerked his shoulders forward and simulated a violent, deep coughing fit. The sudden, harsh sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. I immediately stepped forward, playing my designated role with frantic, practiced urgency. I swiftly brought the thick white napkin directly to his mouth, loudly expressing my profound concern that he was actively choking on the heavy puree. Under the protective cover of the thick linen fabric, Mason discreetly and forcefully spat the entire toxic slurry directly into the center of the cloth. I quickly balled the soiled napkin into my fist, wiping the corners of his mouth to ensure absolutely no trace of the powdery paste remained on his pale lips. Victoria instantly spun back around, her eyes wide with sudden, sharp alarm. She aggressively demanded to know what had just happened, her voice losing its sweet artificial melody and dropping into a harsh, commanding tone. I offered her an apologetic, helpless look, quickly explaining that his fragile throat muscles must have spasmed unexpectedly while he was trying to swallow. I assured her that he had safely ingested the majority of the medication before the coughing fit began. She stared intensely at the balled-up napkin securely clutched in my right hand, her dark, calculating eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. The silence in the room stretched out into a terrifying, agonizing eternity. I held my breath, silently praying that my impromptu performance was convincing enough to satisfy her ruthless, demanding nature. Finally, the rigid tension in her shoulders slowly released. She let out a heavy sigh, expressing her frustration at the messy interruption, and calmly instructed me to throw the ruined napkin into the kitchen trash. The execution of our desperate plan had worked perfectly. We had successfully navigated the deadly minefield of the poisoned routine. Hours later, the house plunged into deep silence. The terrifying performance of the evening had finally concluded. I sat alone in the darkness of my small guest bedroom on the second floor. The thick curtains were drawn tightly shut. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the glowing screen of my encrypted tablet illuminating my tired face. My hands trembled as I held the digital device, my eyes locked onto the live surveillance feed streaming directly from the hidden microlenses I had wired into the ceiling vents. Victoria walked swiftly down the carpeted hallway, stepping right into her private home office. She closed the door, pulled out a hidden burner phone, and made a secret call. I pressed the specialized earpiece deeper into my right ear canal, holding my breath, as if the absolute slightest sound in my dark bedroom could somehow transmit back through the digital feed and instantly alert her to my hidden presence. The encrypted audio feed crackled for a fraction of a second before the complex frequency finally stabilized, delivering crystal-clear sound directly from the tiny microbug hidden securely in her ceiling vent. I watched the grainy green-tinted night vision video feed glowing brightly on the glass screen of my tablet. Victoria paced back and forth across the plush carpet of her private office. The sweet, melodic tone she used just moments ago to feed my son his poisoned dinner had completely vanished from her voice, replaced by a harsh cadence so incredibly cold and devoid of basic human empathy, it made my skin physically crawl. She held the cheap, untraceable plastic burner phone tight against her pale cheek, her dark eyes staring blankly at the wall. I heard a deep, resonant, and unmistakably masculine voice answer on the other end of the secure line, his tone brisk, cautious, and highly professional. She did not exchange polite pleasantries. She did not offer a warm greeting or ask how his evening was going. She simply addressed the man on the other end of the line as Chief. The casual, arrogant authority in her voice indicated a long-standing, highly transactional relationship built entirely on shared secrets and mutual greed. My racing mind frantically began trying to match the deep voice to any of the numerous medical specialists, physical therapists, or hospital administrators who had constantly floated through our complicated lives over the past 7 grueling years. The unknown man immediately asked her for a detailed status update, his voice completely stripped of any comforting bedside manner or professional compassion. Victoria stopped her nervous pacing and stood perfectly still in front of her large mahogany desk, her posture rigid and demanding. She told him that the original timeline had been slightly accelerated due to unforeseen logistical complications with her offshore banking transfers. She spoke with the detached clinical efficiency of a ruthless corporate auditor aggressively liquidating a failing physical asset to satisfy a massive debt. She stated clearly, her voice echoing sharply in my earpiece, that the final dose is ready for tomorrow night. My chest tightened painfully, a thick, cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck and soaking the collar of my shirt. Tomorrow night. That was the absolute final deadline. That was the exact moment my paralyzed son was permanently scheduled to take his final, fatal breath under his own roof while she watched him slowly die. The man on the phone hummed in quiet agreement, a dry, dismissive sound that conveyed absolutely no hesitation, moral conflict, or basic human regret. Victoria then leaned forward, resting her free hand heavily on the polished wood of her desk, her knuckles turning slightly white under the tension. She told him she was rapidly finalizing the physical preparations on her end, but she needed absolute, undeniable confirmation regarding his side of the dark arrangement. She aggressively demanded to know if the official paperwork was ready. The man sighed heavily, the breathy sound crackling sharply through the digital audio feed and filling my quiet bedroom. He firmly assured her the essential documents were already completed and securely locked away inside his private office drawer. Victoria was absolutely relentless. She explicitly stated that she needed the official death certificate pre-signed and completely ready for immediate processing, the exact second she made the frantic emergency call to the paramedics. She dictated the fabricated medical narrative with terrifying, unyielding precision. She told him the official cause of death had to be listed as acute heart failure due to severe long-term paralysis complications. She explicitly demanded that he ensure there would be absolutely no autopsy, no unnecessary police investigation, and no lingering questions from curious local detectives seeking a sudden promotion. The man on the line paused for a brief, incredibly tense moment before cautiously asking about the final status of his compensation. Victoria let out a low, deeply humorless laugh that sent a jagged, freezing shard of solid ice straight down my spine. She promised him with absolute and terrifying certainty that he would get his 30% cut of the massive life insurance payout as soon as the ink dried on the final settlement papers. The chilling call abruptly ended. Victoria carelessly tossed the cheap burner phone into the bottom drawer of her heavy desk, turned off the bright overhead light, and calmly walked out of the dark office entirely unaware that she had just confessed to premeditated murder on a highly secure cloud-based digital recording. I sat completely frozen in the suffocating darkness of my small guest room, the bright glowing screen of the surveillance tablet casting a pale, ghostly light across my violently trembling hands. The sheer magnitude of her horrific multi-layered conspiracy finally slammed into my fragile reality with the devastating, unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. We were not simply dealing with a greedy sociopathic wife looking to quickly cash out a massive insurance policy and blindly run from a violent mob syndicate. She had actively recruited a highly respected, high-ranking medical professional into her deadly, inescapable web of lies and deceit. She had the influential chief of surgery on her personal, untraceable payroll. The dark implications were absolutely staggering, completely overwhelming my ability to logically process the profound betrayal. This man was extremely likely the very same head doctor who had personally overseen Mason and his initial complicated trauma recovery. He was the trusted man who had consistently prescribed his powerful daily medications and the primary expert who had formally validated his permanent, irreversible paralysis directly to the skeptical insurance boards. He was a highly trusted pillar of the local medical community, a respected man whose professional word was considered absolute gospel by every single hospital administrator and veteran police officer working in the entire county. My initial desperate paternal instinct to call the local authorities immediately withered and died painfully in my chest. If I blindly dialed 911 right now and dragged screaming squad cars to my front lawn, it would be an absolute, unmitigated disaster. The responding patrol officers would carefully look at the complex scene, they would politely listen to my frantic, seemingly unhinged accusations, and then they would immediately call the primary care physician to verify the highly specialized medical context. They would inevitably call the chief of surgery. They would defer entirely to his corrupted, bought and paid for medical expertise without asking a single follow-up question. He would calmly assure the investigating detectives over the phone that poor Mason was simply suffering from expected, tragically common end-stage complications, completely validating Victoria and her flawless, fabricated narrative. The local police would quietly close the active file, offer their deepest, most sincere condolences to the bravely grieving widow, and legally leave my defenseless son to be quietly and systematically murdered. The brilliant, suffocating perfection of her inescapable trap was absolute. We were entirely surrounded by a massive, impenetrable wall of respected medical and legal authority that she had spent 7 long years meticulously building and secretly paying off. We absolutely could not call for outside help because the very people assigned to protect us were already acting as her loyal, well-paid accomplices. We were completely and utterly alone in this dark house. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the house was submerged in a suffocating tomb-like silence. I sat in the pitch-black guest room staring at the digital audio file saved securely on my tablet. The local police were compromised, entirely subservient to the corrupt medical hierarchy Victoria had carefully bought and paid for. I knew with absolute chilling certainty that if I stayed in this house and tried to handle this on a local level, both Mason and I would be dead by tomorrow midnight. I needed an authority that operated far above the county lines, a force that could completely bypass the local corruption and strike directly at the heart of the mob syndicate. I slipped out of my stiff shoes, pulling on a pair of dark rubber-soled work boots. I moved through the silent, shadowed hallways with the practiced, silent grace of a ghost. I paused outside the master bedroom, holding my breath as I listened to the soft, rhythmic sound of Victoria sleeping deeply, entirely confident in her flawless, deadly plan. I bypassed the front door, knowing the digital smart lock would loudly chime and immediately betray my quiet exit. Instead, I carefully slid open the rear patio door, wincing at the microscopic friction of the metal track, and stepped out into the freezing, damp night air. I walked briskly through the wet grass, hopped the low wooden fence into the neighboring yard, and made my way down the quiet block to where I had parked my truck earlier that afternoon. I climbed into the heavy cabin, keeping the headlights entirely switched off as I slowly rolled down the suburban street. Once I was a mile away, I turned the lights on and slammed my foot heavily onto the gas pedal. I drove straight toward the towering skyline of downtown Baltimore, my mind locked onto a singular, desperate target. I was heading directly to the federal authorities. The Baltimore FBI field office was an imposing, brutalist concrete fortress surrounded by heavy steel barricades and high-security fencing. I parked my truck in a desolate overnight lot across the street and walked purposefully toward the brightly lit security pavilion. The biting wind whipped off the dark harbor, but I felt absolutely nothing. The adrenaline burning through my veins kept me entirely focused. I walked through the heavy glass doors and approached the thick, bulletproof glass of the main reception desk. An exhausted, visibly irritated federal agent looked up from his glowing computer monitor. He wore a wrinkled blue shirt and a loose tie, clearly annoyed by the arrival of a disheveled old man at 4 a.m. I kept my voice perfectly steady and demanded to speak directly to the lead investigator of the medical fraud and racketeering task force. The agent sighed heavily, rubbing his tired eyes, and began reciting a rehearsed bureaucratic dismissal. He told me to go home, get some sleep, and call the general tip line during normal business hours. He tried to politely brush me off as just another paranoid late-night conspiracy theorist wandering in from the cold streets. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or frantically wave my arms. I simply placed my encrypted tablet flat against the small metal transaction tray located directly under the thick glass. I hit play on the audio file I had isolated just an hour ago. The deep, unmistakable voice of the prominent chief of surgery echoed sharply from the small digital speakers. It was followed immediately by Victoria coldly outlining the pre-signed death certificate and the 30% cut of the massive life insurance payout. The federal agent stopped talking instantly. His tired posture completely vanished, replaced by an intense, rigid focus. He stared at the glowing tablet, his eyes widening in profound shock as the undeniable audio confession played out in the quiet, sterile lobby. He recognized the deep, authoritative voice of the corrupt surgeon immediately. He did not say another word to me. He simply picked up his heavy desk phone, punched in a secure 3-digit extension, and urgently requested his commanding supervisor to get down to the lobby right now. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting inside a stark, windowless interrogation room, deep inside the secure federal building. 3 senior agents in sharp, dark suits sat across from me at a heavy aluminum table. I laid out the entire horrific narrative from the very beginning. I detailed the stolen settlement money, the brutal underground loan from the New Jersey crime syndicate, the forged signatures, the paralyzed son, and the meticulously orchestrated medical murder plot. I handed over the digital drives containing the offshore bank statements, the hidden camera footage of the poisoned meals, and the damning audio recordings. The lead agent, a tall, severe woman with sharp gray eyes, listened in absolute silence. When I finally finished my exhausted explanation, she leaned forward and interlaced her fingers. She told me that for the past 3 years, the FBI had been desperately trying to crack a massive, highly sophisticated medical racketeering ring operating within the city hospitals. They knew a high-ranking surgeon was actively facilitating major insurance fraud for organized crime. But the man was so heavily insulated and politically protected that they could never find a single shred of actionable concrete evidence to secure a federal wiretap. Victoria had not just planned a murder. She had unwittingly handed the FBI the exact golden key they needed to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. They had the proof they needed, but it was not enough to simply arrest Victoria right now. The lead federal agent looked at me with a grim, deeply sympathetic expression. She carefully explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of prosecuting high-level corruption. To make the severe federal racketeering and attempted murder charges stick flawlessly in a court of law, they absolutely could not move prematurely. If they arrested her now, her expensive defense lawyers would easily claim she was just venting frustration on a private phone call and never actually intended to carry out the act. The corrupt surgeon would instantly burn his files and quietly slip away. To bring the entire syndicate down, the FBI needed to execute a flawless, highly coordinated sting operation. They had to catch Victoria in the absolute undeniable act of actively administering the final lethal dose. The agent placed her hands flat on the cold metal table and told me the agonizing truth. I had to go back to the house. I had to pretend everything was perfectly normal. The FBI would have heavily armed tactical teams surrounding the entire perimeter and specialized emergency medical units waiting completely out of sight in the darkness of the surrounding suburban neighborhood. But when the critical moment of tomorrow night finally arrived, I was strictly ordered that I absolutely could not interfere. I had to stand by and actively let Victoria plunge the fatal syringe into his feeding tube, to legally guarantee her permanent destruction and ensure she could never hurt him again. I had to suppress my screaming instincts and watch my helpless son be deliberately poisoned one last time. The weight of that horrific directive crushed the air completely out of my lungs as I drove back to the house under the cover of early morning darkness. I slipped back through the sliding glass patio door, silently removed my heavy work boots, and collapsed onto my small guest bed. Sleep was an absolute physical impossibility. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, I saw the sterile clinical image of a syringe descending toward my son. The agonizing hours of the morning stretched into an interminable, suffocating blur. Victoria woke up just before 8 o'clock, moving through the house with the brisk, cheerful energy of a woman entirely unburdened by conscience. I sat at the kitchen island, forcing myself to swallow dry toast and bitter coffee, watching her hum a light melody while she wiped down the immaculate marble countertops. The sheer duality of her existence was mind-numbing. She was simultaneously a picture-perfect suburban caregiver and a cold-blooded, highly calculating apex predator preparing for a scheduled execution. Throughout the agonizingly long afternoon, the tension inside the house grew so thick and oppressive, it felt like I was wading through wet concrete. I knew with absolute certainty that heavily armed federal agents were already moving into position outside. I knew specialized surveillance vans were quietly parked on the adjacent suburban blocks, patching directly into the encrypted video feeds I had painstakingly wired into the ceiling vents. I knew sniper teams and tactical breach units were silently staging behind the dense tree lines of the neighboring backyards. Yet looking out the large bay windows, the quiet neighborhood appeared entirely mundane and undisturbed. It was a phantom war zone, and my paralyzed son was sitting directly at ground zero. As the sun finally began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the manicured front lawn, the atmosphere inside the living room fundamentally shifted. The casual, cheerful mask Victoria had worn all day slowly began to slip, replaced by a rigid, hyper-focused intensity. I sat in my usual leather armchair, a heavy hardcover book resting unopened on my lap. I was sweating bullets, a cold, clammy moisture coating the back of my neck and soaking the collar of my shirt. My hands gripped the thick armrests so tightly, my knuckles throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. Victoria moved into the kitchen to begin the final lethal routine. She did not bother with the elaborate, brightly colored pill dispenser tonight. The time for slow, methodical poisoning was over. She opened a locked, reinforced steel lockbox she kept hidden deep inside the pantry, behind an array of large cereal boxes. I watched out of the corner of my eye as she extracted a small, clear glass vial and a sterile, sealed plastic syringe. My heart slammed a frantic, bruising rhythm against my ribs. I forced my breathing to remain slow and steady, staring blankly at the printed pages of my book, while my peripheral vision tracked her every single movement. She broke the sterile seal on the plastic packaging with a sharp, distinct snap that echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. She inserted the long metal needle into the rubber stopper of the glass vial and slowly pulled back the plastic plunger. A thick, cloudy liquid filled the transparent cylinder. It was not a crushed vitamin supplement or a black market sedative designed to induce sleep. It was the final devastating chemical agent provided by the corrupt chief of surgery, explicitly designed to mimic the exact physiological symptoms of massive spontaneous heart failure. She tapped the side of the plastic tube with her manicured fingernail, forcing a tiny air bubble up through the cloudy liquid, and pushed the plunger just a fraction of an inch to clear the needle. She turned away from the marble island, holding the lethal syringe casually at her side, and walked slowly into the living room. Every step she took toward Mason felt like a heavy, booming drumbeat, echoing directly inside my skull. The hidden microscopic earpiece secured deep inside my right ear canal crackled softly with sudden static. A calm, deeply distorted federal voice whispered a sharp, singular command directly into my brain, ordering me to hold my position and explicitly forbidding me from intervening. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood, violently suppressing the overwhelming primal urge to throw myself across the room and physically tear her apart. Mason sat completely motionless in his motorized wheelchair, positioned perfectly in the center of the plush living room rug. He had been playing his tragic paralyzed role flawlessly all day, but as Victoria approached him with the cloudy syringe, the absolute terror became completely uncontainable. His breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. His eyes, wide and filled with raw, unadulterated panic, darted away from Victoria and locked directly onto my face. He was silently pleading with me, begging his father to stop the monster standing right in front of him. I stared back into his terrified eyes, projecting every ounce of strength and reassurance I possessed, silently demanding that he hold his nerve for just a few more agonizing seconds. Victoria stopped directly beside his wheelchair. She reached down with her free hand, her fingers gently brushing the sweat-dampened hair away from his forehead. It was a gesture of terrifying manufactured affection, so deeply grotesque, it made my stomach violently churn. She leaned down close to his face, her dark eyes entirely devoid of any human warmth or hesitation. "Time for your medicine, honey," she coos, her voice dripping with that same sweet synthetic melody she used to deceive the entire world. She reached for the clear plastic feeding tube port, surgically located on his lower abdomen, her fingers expertly undoing the small safety cap. She raised the syringe, the thick, cloudy liquid catching the soft, ambient glow of the living room lamps, glowing with evil intent. She carefully aligned the tip of the plastic tube with the open port. Mason squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling as he braced for the lethal injection. I squeezed the armrests of my chair, my entire frame coiled tighter than a steel spring, desperately waiting for the invisible agents outside to give the final life-saving signal. I watched her thumb firmly press against the flat plastic top of the plunger. Just as Victoria pushes the plunger down, a catastrophic, deafening explosion of splintering wood and shattering metal absolutely obliterates the front of the house. The heavy, solid mahogany front door is violently kicked, completely off its reinforced steel hinges, sending massive chunks of sharp, jagged wood flying like deadly shrapnel across the entryway floor. Blinding, searing beams of white tactical flashlights instantly pierce the dim darkness of the living room, crisscrossing wildly across the walls and blinding everyone in their immediate path. An incredibly massive, completely overwhelming swarm of heavily armed FBI agents dressed in dark tactical gear completely floods the living room, their heavy combat boots pounding a deafening rhythm against the hardwood floor, screaming with absolute terrifying, unyielding authority for Victoria to immediately drop the highly lethal syringe. The heavy plastic syringe clattered to the polished hardwood floor, the cloudy liquid spilling across the rug as Victoria was violently slammed against the wall. A dozen heavily armed federal agents swarmed the living room, their tactical gear rustling as they secured the perimeter. Two towering agents pinned Victoria swiftly, pulling her arms behind her back and locking heavy handcuffs around her wrists. The pristine, untouchable mask she had worn for 7 years shattered in an instant. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious rage, stripping away every ounce of the sweet wife she pretended to be. She did not scream or beg for mercy. Instead, she stared directly at me, with eyes so full of concentrated hatred that they burned right through the chaotic scene. She knew I had orchestrated her downfall. An agent roughly pulled her toward the ruined front doorway, marching her out into the cold night air, where a line of police cruisers sat silently waiting. The oppressive tension that had gripped my house for years was suddenly shattered, replaced by the heavy presence of federal law enforcement. I rushed to Mason. My son was shaking uncontrollably in his wheelchair, his chest heaving with massive, ragged gasps of air. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his shoulder, gripping him with the desperate strength of a father who almost lost his child to a monster. He leaned into me, the absolute terror in his eyes slowly melting into a profound, exhausted relief. We had survived. We had beaten the odds and sprung the perfect trap. Paramedics rushed into the room, gently transferring him from the mechanized prison chair onto a mobile stretcher to evaluate his vitals and check for any residual toxins. As the medical team worked efficiently, the lead federal agent, the tall woman with the sharp gray eyes I had met at the downtown field office, walked slowly through the debris of the ruined entryway. She instructed her tactical team to secure the digital recordings and collect the shattered remains of the lethal syringe for the evidence locker. She then turned her intense focus entirely on me. She gestured towards the formal dining table, instructing me to sit down. Mason, having been cleared of immediate medical danger, insisted on staying in the room. He sat in a sturdy wooden chair right beside me, his legs resting freely, no longer bound by the heavy leather straps. The lead agent pulled up a chair opposite us, resting a thick manila folder on the polished oak surface. Her expression was incredibly grim, devoid of any celebratory triumph over the successful sting operation. She looked at us with a heavy, deeply profound sympathy that made my stomach twist into nervous knots. She told us that the nightmare we had just survived was infinitely darker and vastly more complex than a simple case of spousal greed or an escape from a mob loan. Victoria was not just a rogue wife trying to cash out a life insurance policy. She was a highly trained, deeply embedded operative for an elite underground medical fraud syndicate. The federal agent folded her hands over the thick file and laid out the horrifying scale of her true identity. She explained that the syndicate operated on a massive national level, functioning like a highly sophisticated corporate entity completely devoid of human morality. Victoria held a specific specialized title within this dark organization. She was known as a broker. Her exclusive job was to meticulously hunt, profile, and infiltrate the lives of independently wealthy, highly successful men who lacked close, nosy, extended families. She was trained to become the perfect, loving partner, embedding herself so deeply into their trust that they would willingly sign over total financial and medical control without a second thought. Once the legal groundwork was fully secured, the syndicate would orchestrate a tragic, seemingly random physical accident. The agent looked directly at Mason, her voice softening just a fraction. She confirmed what we had slowly begun to suspect. The devastating car crash that had supposedly paralyzed him 7 years ago was never an accident. It was a precise, professionally executed hit designed to cause maximum physical trauma without actually ending his life. The terrifying scope of the conspiracy ran deep into the fundamental roots of the medical system. The syndicate utilized the massive untraceable cash reserves from their offshore accounts to heavily bribe influential medical professionals. The prominent chief of surgery we had heard on the hidden audio bug was a primary asset on their payroll. When Mason was brought into the emergency room clinging to life, the corrupt surgeon took absolute control of his file. He deliberately altered the magnetic resonance imaging results and falsified the neurological assessments. He intentionally misdiagnosed my son as paralyzed from the waist down, condemning him to a wheelchair, when he simply needed standard physical therapy to fully recover. This manufactured tragedy served a brilliant dual purpose. It instantly triggered massive multi-million-dollar insurance payouts for catastrophic life-altering injuries, and it granted Victoria the absolute unquestioned sympathy of the community. She was universally hailed as a saintly caregiver, effectively shielding her and the syndicate from any outside suspicion while they systematically drained the accounts dry. The $20 million loan from the New Jersey crime syndicate was not a mistake. It was a calculated, deliberate extraction method. The medical syndicate used the rival mob banks to quietly launder their stolen assets intentionally, using the victim as the legal collateral. Victoria was never running away from a bad debt. She was successfully closing the account. The pre-signed death certificate from the corrupt surgeon was the standard operating procedure for liquidating the final life insurance policy and cleanly erasing the evidence. The agent paused, letting the immense weight of the absolute truth settle over us. My son had been a carefully selected target in an industrialized hunting operation. Every single moment of pain, every tear, every lost year had been deliberately manufactured for profit. The lead agent reached out and unfastened the metal clasp on the thick manila folder. She flipped it open and slid it across the smooth wooden table. The file contained highly detailed background reports, forged marriage licenses, and glossy photographs of two other men. They were older, independently wealthy, and smiling brightly beside a woman who looked exactly like Victoria, though her hairstyle was drastically different in each picture. The agent tapped the glossy paper with her index finger, her sharp gray eyes locking onto mine with chilling intensity. She told me that Mason was not her first husband. The agent stated grimly that my son was actually victim number 3. She pointed to the first photograph, explaining that the man had tragically died of sudden heart failure, exactly 7 years after a catastrophic horseback riding accident left him confined to a wheelchair. She pointed to the second photograph, detailing an identical story of a wealthy entrepreneur who suffered fatal respiratory failure 7 years after a suspicious boating collision severed his spine. She told us that Victoria was a professional black widow executing a flawless cyclical business model that ended in murder every single time. The gravity of those words hung in the stifling air, settling over my shoulders like a lead shroud. The lead agent closed the folder with a sharp snap. Outside, the flashing lights of the federal cruisers painted the walls in a frantic rhythm. I stood up from the dining table, my legs heavy, and walked into the chaotic entryway where Victoria was currently detained. 2 towering agents had her pinned against the wallpaper, meticulously searching her pockets and checking the heavy steel handcuffs around her pale wrists. For a brief fraction of a second, she attempted to deploy her best defense mechanism. She forced tears into her dark eyes, her lower lip trembling with practiced vulnerability, and let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. She looked frantically around the room, playing the part of the deeply confused, terrified suburban wife who could not understand why these frightening men with large guns were destroying her home. She locked eyes with me, projecting a masterful illusion of absolute heartbreaking innocence, and begged me to tell them there had been a terrible mistake. The lead agent stepped right beside me, holding the digital audio recorder high. She did not say a single word. She simply pressed the small playback button. The crystal-clear, incriminating audio of Victoria demanding a forged death certificate and explicitly promising a 30% cut of the life insurance payout filled the entryway. The recording played, bouncing off the ruined walls and drowning out the sounds of the raid. As the audio captured her final chilling laugh, The fake tears welling in Victoria's eyes instantly vanished. The pathetic, trembling posture she had assumed completely evaporated. The transition was sudden and absolute. The mask of the innocent, weeping caregiver shattered into a million pieces right in front of my eyes. Her face twisted into a terrifying expression of pure, unadulterated malice. The manufactured sweetness melted away, revealing the cold, calculating apex predator, lurking just beneath the surface. She stopped struggling against the agents and stood perfectly still, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a burning, concentrated venom. She let out a harsh laugh that sounded like grinding glass, ignoring the federal agents holding her arms. She tilted her chin up, looking at me with arrogant superiority. She spat venomous curses directly at my face, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She openly mocked my desperate attempts to save my son, laughing at how incredibly easy it had been to infiltrate my life and drain my financial assets. She sneered at my stupid, trusting heart, detailing how she had manipulated my paternal instincts to build her perfect alibi. She bragged about the stupidity of the local medical boards, the blind ignorance of the insurance adjusters, and the unquestioning loyalty I had shown her while she prepared to murder my only child. She told me I was nothing more than a temporary profitable stepping stone in a much larger design. She boasted that her syndicate lawyers would tie the federal courts in procedural knots for decades, promising she would walk entirely free while I spent the rest of my life jumping at shadows. While Victoria spewed her toxic monologues in my ruined entryway, the immense, unstoppable machinery of the federal justice system was executing a massive, coordinated strike across the entire city. The lead agent raised a tactical radio to her lips, requesting a status update from the various strike teams positioned throughout the metropolitan area. The crackling responses confirmed the absolute devastating collapse of the entire medical fraud syndicate in a single perfectly orchestrated night. 10 miles away, in the pristine, brightly lit corridors of the most prestigious hospital in the county, a heavily armed tactical unit breached the secure doors of the executive administrative wing. The corrupt chief of surgery, the man who condemned my son to a wheelchair for profit, was violently pulled from his plush leather chair and thrown to the polished floor. Federal agents systematically seized his encrypted computer servers, his hidden physical ledgers, and the locked desk drawer containing the pre-signed fraudulent death certificates. His entire legacy of respected medical authority was instantly reduced to a massive crime scene. Simultaneously, down at the dark waterfront of Pier 4, another federal task force executed a flawless high-speed interception. The violent underground loan sharks who held the fraudulent $20 million debt anchored to my paralyzed son were entirely surrounded. Black tactical vehicles swarmed the desolate shipping yard, cutting off every avenue of escape. The mob enforcers were ripped from their luxury SUVs, their illegal weapons seized, and their complex offshore laundering operation completely dismantled before they even knew what hit them. The intricate web of medical misdirection, insurance claims, and violent mob intimidation that Victoria had relied upon was being systematically burned to the ground. Every corrupt surgeon, every complicit physical therapist, and every violent enforcer connected to her specific operation was waking up to the terrifying reality of a federal indictment. The syndicate had operated in the arrogant certainty of the shadows for years, but tonight the blinding light of federal justice was exposing all their twisted secrets. The lead agent lowered her tactical radio, a small grim smile touching the corners of her mouth. She looked directly at Victoria, who was still fiercely glaring at me, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic destruction of her criminal empire unfolding across the city. The agent calmly informed her that the chief of surgery was currently in federal custody and actively singing to secure a highly favorable plea deal. She informed her that the offshore accounts had been entirely frozen and the mob enforcers were sitting in heavily guarded federal holding cells. Victoria's arrogant, venomous sneer finally faltered. The color rapidly drained from her face as the devastating reality of her defeat pierced her profound, sociopathic confidence. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words completely failed her. The towering agents gripped her arms tightly, preparing to drag her out through the shattered doorway and into the waiting police cruiser. As they pulled her toward the flashing lights, a deliberate sound echoed from the living room. The sharp click of a heavy metal buckle being unfastened cut through the chaotic ambient noise of the raid. Victoria stopped struggling, her head whipping around to look back into the house. Mason sat in the center of the room. His hands, which had supposedly been useless for 7 agonizing years, moved with smooth, deliberate precision. He unbuckled the thick leather straps securing his feet to the metal footrests. He placed his boots firmly on the solid hardwood floor. The entire room fell into a stunned, breathless silence as my son placed his hands on the armrests and pushed himself upward. He slowly stood up, his posture perfect, rising to his full towering height. The manufactured paralysis, the tragic medical illusion that had dictated our entire existence, was finally broken. Mason walked smoothly across the ruined living room, stopping just inches away from Victoria. He looked down at this woman who had stolen 7 years of his life. His expression carved from solid ice. "Keep the chair," Mason tells her coldly. "Where you are going, you will need the seat." The aftermath of that single explosive night was not a sudden magical transition into immediate happiness. The hard reality of severe chemical restraint and 7 years of forced agonizing muscular atrophy does not simply vanish overnight just because the villain is finally locked away in a federal cell. The physical and psychological road to actual recovery was incredibly brutal, paved with profound pain, intense frustration, and rivers of actual sweat. I transformed our spacious ground-floor dining room into a state-of-the-art physical therapy center. We hired specialized, fully vetted rehabilitation experts who understood the immense trauma of severe toxic exposure and extreme muscular degradation. I watched my son, day after agonizing day, fight a desperate, gritty war against his own severely weakened body. There were numerous mornings when the sheer pain was so entirely overwhelming that he openly wept, his trembling arms giving out as he tried to simply support his own body weight on the parallel walking bars. I stood right there beside him during every single grueling session, wiping the cold sweat from his pale forehead, offering a strong shoulder when his legs inevitably buckled, and firmly reminding him of the sheer, undeniable fact that he had survived an impossible nightmare. He did not magically leap out of that chair and start running marathons. The recovery process was a slow, punishing grind measured in incredibly small, hard-earned increments. First, it was standing unassisted for 60 continuous seconds. Then it was taking a single, agonizingly slow step across the polished hardwood floor without relying heavily on the metal support railing. Every single inch of forward progress required a monumental exertion of pure, unadulterated willpower. But Mason possessed an unbreakable, fierce determination forged in the dark fires of pure survival. He refused to let the heavy shadows of his stolen years define his fragile future. I watched the weak, atrophied muscles in his legs slowly rebuild their lost density. I saw the vibrant, healthy color finally return to his pale face, effectively washing away the sickly gray pallor of the toxic chemical feed. We celebrated every tiny victory, because each one proved her wrong. While Mason fought his incredibly brutal physical battles inside the quiet house, I waged an entirely different kind of relentless war in the downtown federal courts. I spent countless, grueling hours sitting inside sterile conference rooms, working directly alongside elite federal prosecutors and specialized forensic accountants. We meticulously traced every single fraudulent wire transfer, unraveling the massive, highly sophisticated financial web Victoria had deliberately constructed to drain my legacy. It was a staggering, deeply complex maze of offshore holding accounts, fake corporate entities, and illegal mob loans. But the sheer volume of concrete, undeniable evidence we had systematically gathered during the sting operation gave the federal authorities absolute, unchecked power to aggressively pursue the stolen assets. They relentlessly hunted every hidden dime, ensuring nothing slipped through the bureaucratic cracks. The government moved with ruthless, devastating efficiency. They swiftly executed aggressive federal asset forfeitures, legally seizing the entire fraudulent yacht fleet that the underground syndicate had purchased with our stolen funds. The massive multi-million-dollar luxury vessels were publicly auctioned off by the state, generating massive waves of cash that the federal prosecutors systematically used to entirely erase the fraudulent $20 million mob debt Victoria had maliciously anchored to my son. Furthermore, the specialized forensic team successfully cracked the primary offshore holding accounts, legally recovering the remaining $12 million of our stolen life savings. We did not just survive the financial destruction. We methodically clawed back every single stolen cent with absolute unforgiving precision. The massive fortune that was meant to violently end his life was successfully returned to safely secure his future. The highly anticipated criminal trials were swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of any dramatic courtroom suspense. Victoria and the deeply corrupt chief of surgery faced a massive, impenetrable mountain of undeniable federal evidence. The crisp audio recordings of their murderous conspiracy, the detailed financial ledgers, and the damning physical recovery of my paralyzed son completely destroyed their expensive legal defenses. They could not charm their way out of a federal indictment. They could not bribe a federal judge. The presiding magistrate looked down at them with absolute unyielding disgust. He explicitly noted the terrifying predatory nature of their industrialized hunting operation and the profound, unforgivable cruelty of chemically torturing an innocent man for pure financial gain. He did not grant them a single ounce of judicial mercy. Victoria and the corrupt surgeon were both sentenced to life in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole. The medical fraud syndicate that had destroyed so many innocent lives was permanently and violently dismantled, their dark legacy erased from the world. I stared at her as the heavy gavel fell, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard closure as she was finally dragged away in chains. A full year slowly passed, washing away the lingering shadows of the horrific nightmare. The stifling, oppressive tension that had suffocated our home for 7 agonizing years was finally gone, replaced, by the warm, comforting light of a genuinely peaceful existence. It was a crisp, clear autumn afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, vivid blue, completely devoid of any dark clouds. I stood side by side with my son at the bustling edge of the Baltimore Inner Harbor. The salty, cool breeze whipped off the choppy water, carrying the distant, cheerful sounds of the bustling city. We stood near the heavy iron railings, watching the small boats slowly drift across the vast horizon line. Mason stood tall and proud, breathing in the fresh, untainted air. He relied heavily on a thick, sturdy wooden cane gripped firmly in his right hand to help support his recovering muscles, but his posture was absolutely perfect. His back was remarkably straight, his shoulders broad and strong. He looked out at the rolling waves, a serene, peaceful smile touching the corners of his mouth. The heavy, dark terror that had once consumed his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound strength. He was a survivor, a man who had walked through the deepest, darkest circles of hell and emerged completely unbroken. His steady, rhythmic breathing was a beautiful, continuous testament to his immense physical power. I stood quietly beside him, my hands resting in my jacket. I looked out at the vast open water, a profound, undeniable realization slowly settling over my heart. A father's fundamental duty to fiercely protect his child does not magically expire when they reach adulthood. It does not vanish when they move out or establish their own independent lives. The primal protective instinct is permanent, enduring, and absolutely unconditional. I had fought a desperate, terrifying war against a monster, disguised as a loving caregiver, and we had ultimately won. We reclaimed our stolen lives piece by painful piece. Looking at my son standing strong and tall in the afternoon sun, I knew with absolute certainty that every single moment of pure terror had been entirely worth the fight. I would gladly face down 1,000 federal agents to keep him safe. The most terrifying monsters in our lives do not hide in the dark. They hide behind warm smiles, cooked meals, and the disguise of a loving caregiver. They use our trust and our deepest vulnerabilities as their ultimate weapons. Never ignore your gut feeling when something feels slightly off, even if it comes from the person sharing your roof. Love should never require you to surrender your awareness. When you suspect manipulation, do not confront it with emotion. Confront it with cold, hard evidence. True family protects you while predators isolate you. Stay vigilant, stay sharp, and protect your legacy. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to find out they were wearing a mask the whole time? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this courageous fight for a son resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video today.